I stood there, my fingers trembling as I picked up the broken pieces of my cane, the sharp crack of the wood still echoing in my ears. My son's words stung more than the fracture. It's always in the way. After years of raising him, of building a life for us, I was now the obstacle. But I wasn't the one in the way anymore. I was about to show him who truly held the power. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Patricia Lowell moved carefully through the wide doorway of her son's home, her hand steadying on the frame for a bite before she crossed into the living room. The smell of lemon polish and candle wax floated faintly in the air, Amber's touch, always angling for a showroom feel. Patricia's cane, smooth oak worn soft by decades of use, tapped once against the hardwood before she placed it beside the wall, just out of the path of traffic. "Make yourself comfortable, Mom," Brian called from the kitchen. His tone was clipped, impatient, the way a man might speak to a guest he didn't quite want to host. She heard the clink of glasses, the pop of a cork. Patricia eased onto the edge of the sofa, her back upright, hands folded neatly in her lap. She never slouched in anyone's house, least of all her son's. From her seat, she could see the cane leaning quietly against the wall, almost like her husband's ghost was standing sentinel there. He had carved it with his own hands, sanding the grain until it gleamed like polished amber. A thing of beauty, a thing of love, and now a thing she depended on more than she liked to admit. Footsteps entered the room. Brian. His gaze swept over the furniture, the rug, the spotless glass coffee table. Then it landed on the cane. He paused. A smile curved his lips, but it was thin, joyless. "This thing," he muttered, striding over. His hand snatched it up before Patricia could move, always in the way. The words dropped like pebbles in a well, casual, dismissive. He gripped the oak in both hands and bent it with a quick, sharp motion. The sound of wood splintering cracked the room open. Patricia's stomach pitched, but she didn't flinch. She sat absolutely still, her spine tall, her gaze fixed not on the broken halves, but on Brian's face. He smirked as if he had tossed out an old magazine. Behind him, Amber emerged from the kitchen, a stemmed glass in hand. She took one sip, then another, and a laugh slipped from her throat. Light, airy, practiced. "Honestly, Brian," she said, swirling her wine, "you did her a favor." That thing always made the place look cluttered. Patricia's hand drifted toward the arm of the sofa, fingers pressing into the fabric for balance. Her chest rose and fell once. She forced her breath steady. She did not scold. She did not ask why. She simply rose, carefully, slowly, her knees stiff, but unbending in resolve. One hand found the counter's edge as she passed the kitchen, gripping it as though drawing strength from cold granite. Her face was unreadable, a perfect mask carved over decades of measured composure. Neither Brian nor Amber spoke as she reached the front door. Perhaps they expected a protest, a plea, a wounded tremor in her voice. None came. The screen door whispered open. A breath of cool evening air slipped in as she stepped outside. By the time the door closed behind her, Patricia had lowered herself into the rocking chair on the porch. The boards beneath her feet creaked softly with each sway. Her lap was empty. Her hands folded, calm and precise, though the phantom weight of the cane haunted her palm. She watched the twilight settle over the street, the sky bruising into shades of violet and gray. The laughter from inside the house drifted faintly through the windows, but she refused to grant it her attention. Minutes ticked, an hour maybe. The porch light flickered on above her, painting her silver hair with a halo she didn't notice. She stared straight ahead, expression fixed in an unreadable calm. Headlights turned slowly into the driveway next door. Carol Jensen's sedan, familiar in its slow hum, parked with practiced care. The neighbor's door clicked open, and Carol stepped out with her usual brisk energy, her cardigan wrapped tight against the breeze. She caught sight of Patricia, still as stone in the rocker, and her stride faltered. "Pat?" Carol's voice carried across the grass, concerned. Patricia did not answer immediately. Her eyes lingered on the horizon, where the last light of day bled away. Then, finally, she turned her head, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes found Carol's, calm but hollowed, as if something had been stripped clean inside her. Carol's mouth opened to speak again, but stopped. The silence between them was heavier than any explanation could be. Patricia's lips pressed together, sealing whatever storm brewed beneath her skin. She looked back toward the darkened street, hands folded tight in her lap. The chair creaked once, then stilled. And when Carol stepped onto the porch, she realized Patricia hadn't moved an inch, but the air around her felt sharpened, as though the breaking of that cane had carved a new line in the sand. The lock on Patricia's home safe turned with a muted click, the sound muffled beneath the hum of her quiet living room. She pulled the door open, the faint scent of iron and dust escaping like the breath of something long sealed. Inside, stacked with her signature orderliness, rested the binder that held her life in print. Her estate binder, the one she hadn't opened in years. She carried it to the desk, its weight solid, its leather cover creaking faintly when she set it down. The desk lamp cast a circle of amber light across the pages, sharpening each typed line into unforgiving clarity. Patricia settled into the chair, her breath steady but shallow, the night stillness pressing around her. She opened the binder, first page. Her will. The words she'd once believed fair, sensible. Her son's name, centered. Bold in legal ink, Brian Lowell, sole heir. Her eyes lingered there. For a moment, her pulse drummed in her ears. A glass clinked softly on the table behind her. Carol's doing. The neighbor had followed her over after the porch silence, bringing chamomile tea as if it were armor. Carol leaned against the doorway now, cardigan sleeves pushed up. "Still got him listed," she murmured. Voice low but edged. Patricia traced one line of text with her finger. The paper was cool, impersonal, but her hand trembled just slightly. "He doesn't understand what it means," Patricia said finally, not looking up. "That this," she tapped the will with one knuckle, "isn't just paper. It's everything I've built, everything I've protected." Carol stepped closer, folding her arms. "You don't owe your life's work to someone who mocks it, especially not someone who mocks you." Patricia's mouth drew into a thin line. She flipped past the page, turning through deeds and titles. Each one a ledger of effort, discipline, sacrifice. Houses she had maintained, savings she had tended like fragile seedlings. There, nestled between property filings, was the letter her husband had written decades ago when he'd updated his own will. His careful script seemed to look back at her, reminding her that legacy was a choice, not an obligation. Amber's voice, sly and careless, returned in memory. "You did her a favor." Patricia's hand stilled on the page. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying the storm rising in her chest. Then she pushed forward, pages whispering under her fingertips, until the binder lay open across the desk in its full weight. At the edge of the desk, beside her reading lamp, rested the broken handle of her cane. She had picked it up after Brian and Amber left her standing on the porch, unable to discard it as trash. The oak gleamed under the light, cracked but dignified, a severed reminder of what had been taken. She reached out and set her palm on it, her thumb finding the groove where her husband's carving knife had once smoothed the grain. A tether, a weapon maybe, but most of all, a memory, stolen from her with one casual smirk. The papers in front of her blurred for a second as her vision tightened, but she blinked it clear. No tears, not tonight. Carol set the tea down gently beside her and stepped back. "You know," she said softly, "there are people who'd honor that binder more than he ever will." Patricia didn't answer. Not yet. She turned another page, as though each one pulled her closer to some decision she hadn't wanted to name. Her hand lingered on the spine of the binder, firm, now, steady. The night pressed silent outside, but in her mind she could still hear the crack of oak splitting in her son's hands. She looked from the page to the broken handle again, and then, with slow precision, she drew a pen across the desk, uncapped it, and laid it beside the binder. The ink tip gleamed in the lamplight. Patricia straightened in her chair. Her lips curved, just barely, but not in sadness. It was the kind of smile a chess player makes, one move before the game begins to tilt. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the streets slick and shining as Patricia stepped carefully from the curb to the office walkway. The polished steel tip of her temporary cane tapped once against the wet pavement, a sharper sound than the oak had ever made. She paused at the door, lifted her chin, and pushed into the building. Gerald Hunt's office smelled faintly of leather and cedar polish, as though the shelves themselves breathed out history. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, law volumes, biographies, and a smattering of novels he'd confessed once to admiring more than statutes. He rose from his desk as she entered, his tie slightly loosened, his expression a warm counterweight to the cool formality of the room. "Patricia," he said, extending both hands. "It's been too long." She accepted his greeting with the quiet composure she'd practiced all her life. Not long enough, perhaps, for the circumstances. He gestured her into the leather chair across from him. The seat swallowed her smaller frame, but she held herself upright, eyes steady. Gerald lowered himself opposite her, sliding a yellow legal pad aside. "What brings you to me today?" Patricia folded her hands in her lap. "A break," she said evenly. Gerald waited. She let the silence breathe for a moment before clarifying, her voice crisp and measured. "My son snapped my cane in two. Said it was always in the way. No tremor, no emotion leaked into the words. They were facts, laid out like exhibits in a trial." Gerald's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone neutral. "And you'd like to make sure he never gets the chance to snap anything else?" Patricia inclined her head once. "That is correct." He opened her file drawer, pulled her binder from where it had been stored during a prior update years ago, and spread the will across his desk. The pages whispered as he turned them, his fountain pen tapping lightly against the corner. "Brian Lowell, sole heir," he read aloud, though gently, as if testing how the words might sit with her now. Patricia's gaze stayed fixed on the broken handle of the oak cane she had set neatly on his desk blotter. The split wood gleamed under his desk lamp like evidence. "Strike his name," she said calmly. Gerald nodded, crossing out the line. "And Amber? She has no place here." Patricia's tone hardened slightly. "Her influence is rot dressed in silk." He didn't argue. His pen moved in deliberate strokes, her words becoming law on the page. "Then where does it go?" he asked, softer now. Patricia leaned forward, her eyes not on the will, but on the rows of books behind him. Stories, knowledge, her life's truest companions. "The Library Foundation," she said. "Scholarships in my name. For children who read in silence the way I once did. For those who understand that words are power." Gerald wrote carefully, line after line, his brows furrowed, but not in doubt, rather in concentration, weaving the clauses that would fortify her wishes beyond contest. When he looked up, Patricia was watching him with that same quiet resolve she'd carried onto the porch the night before. "Pat," he said, "this will hold. Ironclad, no loopholes. They can rage, but they can't touch it." She let out a slow breath, measured but final. Then, reaching for the broken cane handle, she balanced it across her lap as though testing its weight. Her voice was even, but beneath it ran a current sharp enough to cut steel. "He took balance from me," she said. "I'll take balance from him." Gerald leaned back, studying her not as a client but as a general mapping her first strike. For the first time in years, Patricia felt the world tilt, not against her, but in her favor. And as Gerald set the new draft aside to cool the ink, a shadow crossed her mind uninvited. Brian's smirk, Amber's laughter. She pictured how they would look when the certified notice arrived, when they realized the ground beneath them had shifted forever. Her lips pressed thin, her expression unreadable. The lamp flickered slightly in the office as if punctuating the thought. The envelope was heavy, its corners stiff. The return address typed in clinical black. Hunt and Associates, Estate Law. Brian frowned at the certified mail slip the carrier handed him, signed without thanks, and tore it open on the kitchen counter. Amber, still in her silk robe though it was noon, leaned over with a coffee mug in one hand. Steam rose as she craned her neck. "What's this?" Brian scanned the letter, his eyes narrowing with each line. The words were straightforward. Acknowledgement of amended will, confirmation of filed updates, notice of disinheritance clauses. By the time he reached the bottom, his fingers had curled into a fist around the page. She changed it. Amber set her mug down too hard, liquid sloshing over the rim. She snatched the letter from him, skimmed the language, then crumpled it slightly in her grip. Her mouth twisted. She's bluffing. It's scare tactics. Old people make these threats all the time and then walk them back. Brian's jaw worked as he stared at the cabinets. He didn't answer, just shoved the letter flat against the counter, smoothing the crease with a sharp hand. His silence was heavier than any outburst. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through clouds, warming Patricia's garden 2 blocks away. She moved slowly between the rows, gloves on, pulling weeds with a careful patience. The soil gave easily after the rain. A robin hopped along the fence, curious. She hummed an old tune under her breath, one her husband used to whistle when sharpening tools. Carol leaned on the gate, watching. "They got it, didn't they?" Patricia brushed dirt from her gloves, not looking up. The notice was signed for at 11:10. Carol chuckled, shaking her head. "I imagine faces worth framing. They look rattled. I'll bet Patricia only bent again." Tucking fresh mulch around a young rose bush, the steel tip of her cane anchoring her balance as she worked. The storm arrived by evening, not the weather, but Brian. His car screeching to a stop in front of her driveway, door slamming hard enough to echo. He stomped up the walk, the letter clenched in his hand like evidence in a crime. Patricia was on the porch, a tray of tea set neatly between 2 chairs. The air smelled of lemon verbena from the pots she kept near the steps. She poured herself a cup, steam curling into the twilight. Brian's voice cracked across the yard before he even reached her. "You wouldn't really cut me out." He waved the letter like a flag, his face flushed, his chest heaving. Amber wasn't with him this time. Perhaps her rage had been safer contained behind closed doors. Patricia didn't rise. She didn't even glance at the paper he brandished. Instead, she steadied the teapot, filled the second cup, and set it gently on the saucer beside the empty chair. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The only sound was the delicate chime of porcelain. Brian stopped at the foot of the steps, breathing hard. The silence pressed against him, against his anger, and he shifted uneasily, his knuckles whitening around the letter. Patricia lifted her own cup, brought it to her lips, and sipped. She set it down with a faint clink, her eyes never leaving the horizon. Not a word. Her refusal to meet his fury with explanation or defense hollowed the fight right out of the air, leaving his outrage hanging like smoke with nowhere to settle. He took 1 step up, then stopped, glaring down at her, waiting, pleading even, for something, anything. Patricia reached for the teapot again, her hands steady as stone. Brian's jaw tightened, his breath sharp, but he didn't climb another stair. He couldn't. And when Carol's porch light flicked on next door, her silhouette framed in the window, he finally cursed under his breath and turned away. Patricia poured the second cup as though for a guest who had not yet arrived, set the pot back on the tray, and folded her, hands neatly in her lap. Her face remained unreadable, but the teacup on the empty saucer sent its own message. A place no longer reserved for him. Gerald's office blinds were drawn against the late morning sun, the slats casting angled shadows across his desk. Patricia sat opposite him, her hands folded neatly on her lap, cane resting against the chair's arm. Gerald leaned forward, glasses low on his nose, the glow of his monitor painting his features in pale light. "Patricia," he said carefully, "you need to see this." He clicked once, and the screen filled with scanned county filings. A deed record, a supplemental claim. Patricia leaned in, eyes sharp despite the fine print. There it was in bold, public view. Brian Lowell, future owner, Lowell Estate. Patricia's lips pressed together so tightly the lines at the corners of her mouth deepened. Gerald exhaled. It's not legally binding. He has no authority to file it. But people don't always read the law, just the headlines. The implication alone could cause trouble. Patricia didn't answer. Her gaze stayed on the word owner, as though the letters themselves were trying to wrestle something from her grasp. Gerald closed the tab and clasped his hands. We'll move to strike it. I'll file today. It won't stand. Patricia sat back, her shoulders square, the silence around her almost brittle. She did not storm, did not question. She only lowered her eyes to the desk, as if considering how far a son could go when the world offered him rope. That afternoon, Amber proved the point. On her social media page, glossy and curated to perfection, appeared a photo of Brian in front of their house, chin lifted with false authority. The caption, "Big moves ahead for the Lowell legacy." Exciting times. A string of champagne emojis followed, along with congratulatory comments from people who didn't know better. Carol was the one who showed Patricia, phone tilted in her palm as they stood in the garden. They're broadcasting it like a parade float, she muttered, shaking her head. And people are swallowing it. Patricia didn't reach for the phone. She simply looked past the screen to the row of roses she had pruned the day before, their petals opening wide to the sun. Her lips pressed tight again, sealing whatever words might have escaped. The silence stretched until Carol spoke again, softer now. He's tripping on a broken cane, Pat. He doesn't even see the ground crumbling under him. Patricia adjusted her gloves, bent, and clipped a withered bloom from its stem. The steel tip of her cane sank into the soil for balance. She straightened slowly, brushed the petals into her palm, and let them scatter to the earth. That evening, she returned to Gerald's office. The filing had already been drafted. Motion to strike, supporting affidavits, evidence of fraudulent representation. Gerald slid the stack across the desk, the paper crisp, waiting for her. Signature. As she lifted the pen, her hand hovered for a moment. The weight of the act pressed against her chest, the son she had raised claiming her life as if it were a toy to be snatched. And Amber, always smirking at the sidelines, painting it as triumph. She signed. The ink bled dark and final into the page. Gerald gathered the papers, slipping them into a leather folder. By this time tomorrow, the record will be contested. He'll have no standing. Patricia nodded once. Her jaw was firm, but her eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of weariness, not of age, but of betrayal. When she left the office, the dusk had settled heavy over the street. The courthouse clock tower loomed in the distance, striking the half hour, each chime echoing like a gavel. She paused on the steps, the folder in Gerald's hand now behind her, the echo still in her ears. She tightened her grip on the cane. The world was no longer tilted. It was shifting underfoot, and she would not allow Brian to write her story in his ink. The bank smelled of printer ink and recycled air, the kind of place that tried to pass itself off as polished, but hummed with impatience beneath the fluorescent lights. Brian sat across from the loan officer, sleeves rolled to his elbows, charm switched on like a mask. A neat stack of papers lay between them. His application, typed bold, expected transfer of deed, scribbled in justification. The officer tapped his pen against the file, brow furrowing. "Mr. Lowell, you've listed future ownership of the Lowell estate as collateral. You understand we need verified documentation for that?" Brian leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. "It's already in motion. My mother's updating the estate. It's just a matter of paperwork catching up." The officer frowned. "We'd still need official transfer." "Look," Brian said, voice softening to salesman's patter. "You and I both know families don't always update their filings in lockstep. I'm telling you what's happening. You can either get ahead of the curve or miss out on a client with serious assets. The officer glanced at the application again, skepticism clouding his face. He made a note, but his hand lingered over the denial box longer than Brian realized. Across town, Gerald's phone buzzed. He recognized the alert instantly. An inquiry flagged on Patricia's estate account. Within minutes, he was on the line with her. "They're trying to leverage the property," he said flatly, using the claim he filed as if it were fact. Patricia stood at her desk, the oak handle still resting like a sentinel in the corner. She gripped her cane and steadied her voice, then freeze everything tied to it. Today she didn't pace, didn't raise her tone. She simply pressed the command into the air as if dictating law herself. Gerald responded in kind. "I'll contact the county clerk. We'll get ahead of it before a loan officer even considers approval by evening." Patricia's accounts and property ties were secured, locked behind a fortress of legal barricades. Gerald's filings hit the clerk's desk before Brian's request could even clear the first rung of processing. But Amber wasn't deterred. She confronted Patricia outside the grocery store 2 days later, sunglasses oversized, shopping bag slung over one wrist. Her voice was syrupy but sharp as broken glass. "You know, Pat, it's just forward thinking. Brian's setting up for the future. Isn't that what you always wanted, for him to be prepared?" Patricia adjusted the weight of her basket, eyes narrowing only slightly. She answered with precision, her words clipped like shears through overgrown branches. "It isn't preparation. It's theft." Amber blinked, lips parting as if the word stung. For the first time, her composure wavered. She pressed the sunglasses higher, muttered something under her breath, and turned sharply toward her car. The bank's fraud division called Gerald that same afternoon. The forged, expected deed language raised alarms, too bold, too sloppy. A case number was assigned. The file would not disappear quietly. When Gerald told Patricia, she only gave the faintest nod. Let them hang themselves with their own rope. Later that night, Patricia sat at her desk once more, the broken cane handle still in place, a quiet companion to her resolve. She lifted it into her lap, ran her thumb along the split wood, and thought of balance again. How fragile it was, how deliberate one had to be to keep it. On her phone, another notification lit up. Amber's social media posts now gone, deleted without explanation. For the first time that week, Patricia allowed herself a long breath, slow and steady. The battle was escalating, yes, but the silence she commanded remained her sharpest weapon. Outside her window, the courthouse clock struck 9, each chime heavy with warning. Patricia set the cane handle back on the desk, eyes fixed forward. Something in the night air told her Brian would not stop here. The text arrived just after dawn, her phone vibrating against the nightstand like a wasp trapped in glass. Patricia reached for it without hurry, slipping on her reading glasses before she read the message. "You think you can cut me out? Watch what happens when I take back what's mine." There was no signature, no need. The punctuation was jagged, the anger too familiar. She let the phone rest in her palm for several long breaths, the screen glow washing her face pale in the early light. Then she forwarded it to Gerald without a word, attaching only 3 characters in her message, FYI. By mid-morning, Gerald was in motion. "We'll file for a protective order," he told her over the phone, his voice even but clipped with steel. "Not because I think you're fragile, Pat, but because he's reckless. Let him swing his fists against the law instead of your door." Patricia listened, nodding though he couldn't see her. Her eyes traveled to the broken cane handle on her desk, the scar in the wood catching the light. A reminder. Once balance is broken, everything tilts until you set it right again. That afternoon, Carol appeared with a cardboard box tucked under her arm. "You're not sitting unguarded, not with him circling like a vulture," she declared, already stepping onto the porch before Patricia could respond. Inside the box, a set of security cameras, motion-activated, weatherproof. Carol unpacked them with the precision of someone who had raised 3 sons and learned how to wire a backyard floodlight by herself. By dusk, The porch corners blinked with tiny red indicators. Patricia stood by, arms folded, saying little. But when Carol brushed the dust from her hands and straightened up, Patricia touched her shoulder lightly. "Thank you." Carol only nodded. Let him see the eye watching back. That'll cut the swagger. 2 days later, Patricia ran into Amber again, this time in the baking aisle of the grocery store. Amber leaned on her cart, oversized sunglasses perched on her head instead of her face, revealing eyes sharp with disdain. "Patricia," she drawled, as though the name itself were sour. "Word gets around, you know. People are saying you're slipping, forgetting things. Everyone thinks you're losing it." The comment hung in the air, wrapped in sugar, but meant to rot. Amber's smile was wide, deliberate, daring Patricia to react. Patricia adjusted her basket, shifting the weight against her hip. "Duly noted," she said softly, and then, almost absently, she pulled a small notebook from her bag. She clicked a pen, jotted a single line, and closed it again before Amber could glimpse the page. Amber's smile faltered. She cleared her throat, muttered something about needing flour, and wheeled her cart away too quickly. Patricia walked the rest of the aisles in silence, her notebook heavier than her groceries. Each word, each sneer, each threat, it all went into her record, proof, a ledger of every slight. That evening, Patricia visited a downtown shop that specialized in mobility aids. Rows of polished canes gleamed under soft lights. Mahogany, ash, carbon fiber. She moved slowly between them until her hand settled on one with a steel tip and a reinforced shaft, the weight perfect in her grip. Balanced, solid. She tested it on the showroom floor. The sound it made against tile was sharp, certain, nothing like the gentle tap of oak. When she brought it home, she leaned it against the wall beside her desk. The broken handle still sat in its place, but now the two pieces formed a pair, the past and the present, memory and resolve. Outside, the cameras blinked at intervals, recording the stillness of the street. Inside, Patricia sat at her desk, notebook open, pen ready. The night was quiet, but she knew quiet was never permanent. The evaluator's office smelled faintly of pencil shavings and antiseptic, the kind of neutral air meant to soothe nerves. Patricia sat at the small oak table, her new cane propped against her chair, her notebook resting at her side. Across from her, a gray-haired psychologist arranged a stack of forms, his tone pleasant, professional. "We'll go through some memory recall, reasoning, a few problem-solving exercises. Standard procedure, nothing to worry about." Patricia offered a polite smile, though her jaw was set. "Nothing to worry about," he'd said, as though dignity weren't on the line, as though her son's attempt to brand her unfit wasn't carved into the very reason she sat in that room. The questions came, a series of words to remember. She repeated them back without hesitation. A simple puzzle with blocks. She arranged them with crisp precision, her hands steady. Reading comprehension, arithmetic, situational reasoning, all handled with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had cataloged and indexed 1,000 volumes in her career. At one point, the evaluator asked her to draw a clock face showing a specific time. Patricia lifted the pencil and, without pause, drew the circle clean, numbers aligned, hands sharp and correct. She slid the paper back across the table. Her eyes met his. They did not waver. When the session ended, the man leaned back, removing his glasses. "Mrs. Lowell, your scores are flawless, higher than many 20 years younger. I'll prepare the affidavit for the court." "You have nothing to fear." Patricia inclined her head. Fear was never in the room. 2 weeks later, the probate courtroom hummed with restrained tension. Rows of benches filled with curious onlookers and fellow litigants waiting their turn. Patricia sat at the petitioner's table beside Gerald, her steel-tipped cane angled neatly at her side. She wore a tailored jacket, her silver hair swept back, her posture regal. Across the aisle, Brian shifted in his seat, his tie slightly askew, sweat forming along his hairline. Amber sat stiff beside him, her eyes sharp and hostile, darting toward Patricia with open disdain. Judge Linda Carver entered briskly, robe flowing, expression carved from stone. She settled into her seat, glancing at the docket. Lowell versus Lowell, competency challenge. Her voice cut through the room with surgical clarity. Gerald rose, presenting the affidavit. Your Honor, the evaluation returned not merely adequate results, but exemplary. Mrs. Lowell's mental acuity is unimpeachable. The judge skimmed the papers, her brow barely twitching. Scores above average across all categories. Detailed observations confirm no impairment. She turned her gaze toward Brian. On what grounds did you file this claim? Brian cleared his throat, fumbling with the edge of his folder. Your Honor, my mother's been erratic. She's been influenced. Amber leaned in, whispering something, but the judge raised a hand. Quiet, Mr. Lowell. Vague accusations will not suffice. Patricia sat still, hands folded atop her notebook. She had not spoken a word yet. The silence itself had grown powerful, pressing into the courtroom air. The judge flipped the final page of the affidavit, tapped it once against her bench, and set it aside. The claim is dismissed. Baseless, unfounded, and bordering on harassment. Her eyes sliced toward Brian. This court will not be used to settle petty resentments. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Amber's face hardened, lips pressed into a thin, angry line. Brian fidgeted, fingers tugging at his tie, as though it were choking him. Patricia finally leaned toward her microphone, her voice low but steady, carrying through the chamber like a gavel strike. Your cane cracked, she said, eyes locked on Brian. My backbone didn't. The words lingered, heavy, undeniable. Judge Carver gave a curt nod. We're adjourned? The gavel fell, sharp as thunder. Patricia rose slowly, her new cane clicking once against the polished floor, a sound that cut through Brian's silence as cleanly as any verdict. The courtroom was fuller than usual that morning, word of the Lowell dispute having seeped through town like ink in water. Curious eyes filled the benches, whispering until Judge Carver's gavel snapped them into silence. Patricia sat poised beside Gerald, her steel-tipped cane resting against the table. Her gaze remained forward, unflinching. Gerald rose first. Your Honor, we submit evidence of fraudulent filings by Mr. Brian Lowell. A murmur swept through the room. The first witness, a bank officer in a navy suit, took the stand. He adjusted his glasses, hands folded neatly as Gerald approached. Please state what you observed during Mr. Lowell's loan application, Gerald prompted. The officer cleared his throat. Mr. Lowell presented documents listing himself as the future owner of Mrs. Lowell's estate. Included were initials, purportedly hers. Granting authorization, they raised suspicion. Gerald held up a page, its letters magnified on a projection screen. Patricia's supposed initials scrawled at the corner. And what did your handwriting specialist conclude? The officer nodded. The initials were inconsistent with Mrs. Lowell's signature across her verified accounts. Slant, spacing, pressure, all wrong. It was a forgery. A gasp rippled across. The bench's Brian shifted, jaw tight, eyes darting toward Amber. She leaned close, whispering fast, her hand clamped over his arm. Gerald didn't pause. Your Honor, the forgery was not isolated. We traced a series of false filings, documents lodged with the county clerk, all implying Mrs. Lowell's consent. Each bears signatures and marks inconsistent with her known hand. He laid the stack before the judge. Pages fanned open, each one a brick in the wall of deception. Judge Carver flipped through them with clinical precision, her face unreadable until she finally set the papers down. Her voice was flat but edged with disdain. Forgery is felony adjacent, Mr. Lowell. You tread dangerously close to criminal prosecution. Brian's face flushed red, his collar damp with sweat. He opened his mouth, but Amber leaned in sharply, her whisper slicing through the courtroom's hush. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Patricia did not move. She sat still as stone, her hands folded atop her notebook. Only her eyes shifted, briefly catching Carol's across the gallery. Carol raised her brows and muttered under her breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That cane handle looks heavier than his excuses." A ripple of stifled laughter flicked through the back rows, quickly hushed by the bailiff's glare. Judge Carver tapped her gavel once, quieting the room. "Mr. Hunt, I'll review the full filings. Preliminary ruling. Fraudulent claims will be stricken from record. Financial penalties are likely." Brian slumped in his chair, his bravado leaking out like air from a punctured tire. Amber's hand pulled back from his arm, her nails drumming against the table in barely concealed fury. Gerald sat down beside Patricia, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "The walls are closing in, Pat." "He can't wriggle out of this one." Patricia reached for her cane, set its steel tip firmly against the floor, and rose when the judge adjourned for recess. The sound of metal striking polished wood echoed across the chamber, measured, deliberate. She did not look at Brian. She didn't need to. His shame was a weight heavy enough to bow his shoulders. As she stepped out into the hallway, the courthouse chatter buzzed around her, fragments of phrases, gasps of disbelief, whispers of sympathy. She walked through them untouched, each click of her cane cutting a path through the noise. At the far end of the corridor, sunlight spilled through the glass doors. Patricia paused there, her reflection staring back at her in the pane. The woman who looked back was not diminished, not fragile, not broken. But as she pressed a hand against the cool glass, she knew this was only the second strike. He had already proven he was willing to forge, to lie, to risk everything. The next move would be desperate. And desperation, she thought, was always dangerous. The gavel's crack echoed through the chamber like a final nail sealing our coffin. Judge Carver's expression did not soften as she delivered the ruling. "This court imposes fines totaling $85,000 for fraudulent filings, administrative costs, and damages to Mrs. Lowell's estate reputation. Payment is due within 60 days. Failure will result in escalated penalties." Brian's breath left him in a sharp, audible exhale, as though someone had kicked him squarely in the chest. His shoulders slumped forward, the papers in his hand trembling. Amber's reaction was louder. She twisted toward him, her voice a hiss that still managed to slice through the courtroom air. "We'll get it back. Do you hear me? Every dime. She doesn't get to win." Brian didn't answer. His jaw worked, but no words came out. Across the aisle, Patricia remained serene. Her hands were folded on her lap, her cane upright beside her like a staff of office. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. The stillness of her composure was a contrast so sharp it magnified Brian's unraveling. The bailiff announced adjournment, and people began filing out in low murmurs. Gerald gathered his papers, leaning toward Patricia. "This is where we tighten the screws. I'll strengthen the no contest clause in your will, airtight. If Brian tries again, he forfeits any possible claim, even a challenge." Patricia gave a single nod. "Do it." They walked from the courthouse together, Gerald carrying the files, while Patricia's cane struck the marble floor in measured rhythm. Outside, the late afternoon sun cut hard shadows across the steps, the light fierce but clean. Patricia lifted her face to it, steady in her stride. That evening, Carol arrived at Patricia's door with a pie tin balanced in her hands. Blueberry, the crust golden and uneven in the way homemade always was. She set it on the counter with a flourish. "Sweet revenge," Carol quipped, slicing a wedge and handing Patricia a plate. "And sweeter still when it's baked into something they can't touch." Patricia allowed herself the smallest of smiles as she accepted it. The sugar cut through the taste of bitterness that had been lingering at the back of her throat for weeks. Later, when the house was quiet, Patricia took her new cane in hand and moved through her living room, step by deliberate step. She practiced on the rug, then the hardwood, listening to the rhythm of her own balance. The steel tip struck with certainty, no wobble, No falter. She turned, pivoted, crossed again. Each stride steadier than the last. She paused by the mantel where Gerald's paperwork rested in a neat stack. Her reflection in the glass of a framed photo looked back at her. Sharper, calmer, stronger than the woman who had once let her son's smirk silence her. Patricia exhaled, tightening her grip on the cane. Across town, Amber's voice carried through their kitchen, sharp and cutting. "You're going to fix this, Brian. You'll find a way. I didn't marry into this. Family to live in debt." Brian stared down at the judgment papers, his knuckles white where he held them. His silence wasn't strength, it was collapse. Amber slammed a cupboard door hard enough to rattle the glass. "You'd better not let her have the last word." Brian's eyes flicked up at her, bloodshot, hollow, but somewhere beneath the despair burned a dangerous heat. Resentment too big to bury. The article ran on the front page of the Franklin Herald the following Sunday. Gerald's statement was precise, airtight, and impossible to misinterpret. Mrs. Patricia Lowell's estate remained solvent, protected, and fully entrusted in accordance with updated filings. All fraudulent claims have been struck from record. Community literacy initiatives and scholarship endowments will be honored in her name. Beneath it, a photo. Patricia in her garden, steel-tipped cane in hand, sunlight breaking across her shoulders. The picture captured her not as a fragile widow, but as something firmer, unyielding. By noon, copies of the paper lay folded on breakfast tables across town. At the diner on Main Street, patrons murmured over coffee cups. At the hardware store, a clerk shook his head and muttered, "Shame on that boy." Even the librarian placed a copy on the front desk display, as if the words themselves were a public record of vindication. Patricia clipped the article and slid it neatly into her binder, just behind the page where Brian's name had once stood. The steel tip of her cane tapped against the floor as she closed the cover. Across town, whispers worked their way into spaces Brian and Amber once considered safe. At the country club, where Amber had always glided through luncheons on the strength of curated charm, she found her circle shrinking. Old acquaintances now offered tight smiles that dissolved the second she turned her back. Conversation stilled when she entered the room. One afternoon, as she approached a group by the poolside, she caught the tail end of a whisper. "Fraud. Imagine the nerve," followed by muffled laughter. Amber's grip on her glass tightened until the stem snapped, wine spilling down her wrist. Brian didn't fare better. Contractors he had once boasted to avoided his calls. Neighbors who used to wave from their porches turned away as he passed. Even the cashier at the grocery store gave him exact change with a politeness that cut sharper than disdain. That night, unable to bear the silence, Brian reached for his phone. His message was brief, stripped of swagger, almost pleading. "We can fix this." Patricia read it while sitting at her desk. Her new cane leaned against her chair, the broken handle resting beside her lamp. She stared at the words, thumb hovering over the screen, then typed back with steady fingers, "I already did." The reply sent, she powered down the phone and set it face down. She refused to let his desperation invade her evening. Later, Carol stopped by with a casserole, her presence filling the kitchen with the warmth of onion and cheddar. She set the dish on the counter and leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "Well," she said, "looks like the whole town's taking sides." And not his Patricia poured them both iced tea. Her movements calm, unhurried. Carol smirked. Basement of Regret, Chapter 2. He built it himself, and now he's stuck down there with no stairs out. Patricia allowed a small, private laugh to escape. It was not joy, but acknowledgement. The truth of a friend who knew how deep the cracks had spread. Outside, dusk settled, painting the horizon in bruised purples and fading gold. Patricia carried her glass to the porch, cane tapping steady against the boards. From her seat, she could see across the street where neighbors lingered, one of them holding a folded copy of the Herald. They raised it slightly in her direction, then tipped their chin in quiet respect. Patricia inclined her head back, silent acknowledgement of their gesture. But as she turned her gaze to the street's shadows, her hand tightened on the cane. She knew public shame was not enough for Brian. Resentment fed in the dark. And men who fed their failures often struck hardest when the world thought they were finished. The probate courtroom was packed. Reporters leaned against the back wall with notebooks ready, their pens poised like blades. Townspeople filled the benches, curious to see how far the Lowell feud would stretch before snapping in half. Patricia entered quietly, Gerald by her side, her steel-tipped cane announcing each step in measured rhythm. She wore a dark jacket, pearls at her throat, unpretentious but commanding. She did not scan the gallery. She didn't need to. Eyes found her without invitation. At the other table, Brian slumped forward, his suit wrinkled as though it had been pulled from the back of a closet. Amber sat upright beside him, lips painted too brightly, her gaze darting from the press to Patricia with thinly veiled venom. Judge Carver entered, robe sweeping the floor, and settled behind the bench. The room hushed. Lowell Estate hearing, she announced. We will hear final evidence and issue ruling. Gerald rose, adjusting his tie, and began. Your Honor, over the past months, this court has seen a consistent pattern. Fraudulent filings, forged initials, attempted misappropriation of property, baseless challenges to competency, and direct threats to Mrs. Lowell. Today we consolidate that record. He laid folders across the evidence table one by one, forged documents, bank testimony, the psychologist's affidavit, even the printed threat Patricia had received by text, each piece stacked like a stone in the wall surrounding her estate. Judge Carver flipped through the files with surgical calm. I see no ambiguity here. Amber's composure cracked first. She leaned forward, voice sharp. This is all theater. She's manipulating. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. Mrs. Lowell, you are not counsel. Sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed. The gallery rippled with low murmurs. Amber's cheeks flushed, but she sank back into her chair, her fury trapped behind her teeth. Brian shifted uneasily, tugging at his tie, his eyes darting between the judge, Gerald, and the growing pile of evidence. His hand twitched toward his folder, then fell useless to his lap. Gerald closed his argument cleanly. Your Honor, Mrs. Lowell's will and trust filings are unchallenged, ironclad, and rightful. We ask the court to uphold the disinheritance, enforce restitution, and strike any remaining claims silence fell. Judge Carver leaned forward, her eyes pinning Brian as if he were a boy caught with stolen candy. Forgery, harassment, baseless competency accusations. Mr. Lowell, your conduct has been reckless and self-serving. This court will not indulge entitlement dressed as grievance. Brian's breath hitched. His face crumpled, the bravado that had once fueled his schemes collapsing under the weight of finality. He sank into his chair, head in his hands, shoulders hunched like a man twice his age. The judge continued. The court rules as follows. All fraudulent claims are stricken. Restitution is upheld in full. Disinheritance is final. You are hereby evicted from any claim, past, present, or future, on the Lowell estate. The gavel fell, echoing across the chamber like a door slamming shut. Patricia did not smile. She did not flinch. She only folded her hands atop her notebook, her face composed, serene. Her cane leaned against her chair, its steel tip gleaming faintly in the courtroom light. Across the aisle, Amber hissed something venomous at Brian, but he didn't respond. His body had folded inward, defeated, as if the very air had been pulled from him. Gerald gathered the files, sliding them into his case with quiet precision. It's done, he whispered. Patricia rose slowly, lifting her cane. The sound of its strike against the polished floor was the only answer she gave. She walked out of the courtroom, steady, silent, her victory carved not in words, but in the unshakable balance of her stride. But as the heavy doors swung shut behind her, she knew the battle was not truly over. A son stripped of pride and inheritance was more dangerous than a son drunk on entitlement. And she had seen enough of Brian's eyes to know. Desperation had only just begun to sharpen him. Amber's exit was not quiet. It began with the slam of cupboard doors, the clatter of glassware, and the shrill rise of her voice, echoing down the hollow corridors of the house they had once boasted about at parties. Bills spread across the kitchen table like battlefield debris. Overdue credit cards, loan notices, the court fines stamped in red. "You've ruined us, Brian," Amber spat, tossing another envelope onto the pile. "Do you think anyone at the club looks at me the same now? I can't even walk into a luncheon without whispers biting at my back. And you," her finger jabbed toward him, trembling with rage, "you just sit there and sulk like a boy caught stealing lunch money." Brian's eyes were bloodshot, his tie gone, shirt untucked. He pressed his palms against his forehead, as though if he pushed hard enough, the weight of it all might vanish. "Amber, please." "Please?" She barked a laugh, cold and sharp. "Please won't pay $85,000 in fines. Please won't get us out of debt. Please won't buy me a shred of respect back." She swept her arm across the table, sending the envelopes scattering to the floor. Then she grabbed her purse, her heels clicking against the hardwood like gunfire. When the door slammed behind her, the house fell silent. Brian sat alone, surrounded by paper, proof of everything he'd lost. Within a week, the house went on the market. Creditors circled like vultures. He pawned furniture, sold the watch Amber had once bragged about on Instagram, let the car go back to the bank. Each loss chipped at the man who had once strutted through town like he owned it. By the time he carried his last box into a cramped one-bedroom apartment off the interstate, the swagger was gone entirely. The space smelled of dust and old carpet cleaner, the blinds bent, the fridge humming with an empty echo. He stacked the box against the wall, dropped into a chair missing one armrest, and stared at nothing. His phone lay face up on the counter, screen dark, waiting. He picked it up, typed a message, erased it, typed again. Finally, he settled on 5 words. "Can I come home?" He stared at them, thumb hovering, then hit send before he could think better. Across town, Patricia's phone buzzed softly on her desk. She slid her glasses into place, opened the screen, and read the message. Her face did not shift. Not a flicker of triumph, not a trace of pity. She tapped once, held the delete option for a second longer than necessary, and pressed her thumb down. The message vanished into silence. She closed the phone, set it face down, and turned back to the binder on her desk. Her cane rested across her lap, steel tip gleaming faintly in the lamplight, balanced, steady. Later that evening, Carol stopped by, the night air crisp around her shoulders as she stepped into Patricia's kitchen. She set a casserole dish on the counter, brushed her hands on her jeans, and studied her friend's composed posture. "He reached out, didn't he?" Carol asked. Patricia's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something firmer, quieter, briefly. Carol nodded, pouring them both tea as if the answer was already written. "Some people trip and never get up. That boy's been lying face first in the dirt for years. You just stopped lifting him." Patricia accepted her cup, resting it gently on the table. The steam curled upward, fading, into the kitchen light. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Outside, the night stretched long and unbroken, the street lamps humming against the stillness. In her lap, the cane felt like a line drawn across the past, a boundary no message, no plea, no blood tie could cross. Yet beyond that silence, she knew, desperation was a creature that never died quietly. And Brian, stripped of wife, house, and name, had only begun to learn how dangerous silence could make a man. The newspaper hit doorsteps before sunrise. The headline splashed in black across the fold. "Matriarch defends estate, disinherits son after fraud attempt." The article beneath told the story in Gerald's precise language. Legal filings, courtroom rulings, affidavits laid bare. Yet the weight of it wasn't in the legalese. It was in the photograph that anchored the column, Patricia Lowell seated on her porch, steel-tipped cane upright beside her, a face both calm and resolute. By mid-morning, the town hummed with talk. At the bakery, patrons passed the paper across tables sticky with powdered sugar, nodding in approval. At the post office, an old farmer folded the front page into his pocket, muttering, "Strong woman, stronger spine." Even at the library, a copy rested by the checkout desk, its placement less accident than declaration. The chorus was almost unanimous. Patricia had stood firm. Patricia had won. Patricia had reminded everyone that a backbone doesn't crack as easily as oak. Brian, meanwhile, couldn't cross a parking lot without the weight of eyes. Neighbors once eager for his wave now busied themselves tying shoes or checking phones. At the gas station, two teenagers snickered loud enough for him to hear. "There's the fraud guy." He ducked his head, hood drawn low, and finished pumping in silence. Amber fared worse. Her circle at the country club, once the core of her identity, dissolved overnight. Invitations stopped arriving, conversations hushed when she neared. At one luncheon, she sat alone with a sweating glass of water, overhearing just enough whispers to feel their blades. By week's end, she simply stopped showing up. Her absence spoke louder than her presence ever had. Across town, Gerald stopped by Patricia's house, carrying a stack of clippings. He spread them neatly on her dining table, adjusting his glasses as though arranging evidence for trial. "You've locked every door they rattled," he said, with quiet satisfaction. "No contest clause sealed. Claims struck. Public record on your side. They can knock until their knuckles bleed. It won't matter." Patricia traced the headline with one fingertip, her expression unreadable. "A house is safest when it has no open doors." Gerald smiled faintly, closing his briefcase. "Then yours is a fortress." That evening, Carol arrived with a tote bag of paperbacks for her book club. She plopped the newspaper on Patricia's coffee table with a grin. "Guess what I brought for discussion? Forget novels. This is better than half the fiction we read." The other women laughed, flipping through the pages as though savoring each word. "She didn't just hold her ground," one remarked. "She built a wall," another nodded. "And wrote her own ending." Carol tapped the photo of Patricia with her cane. "Front page heroine." "That's you." Patricia shook her head slightly, lips curving only the barest fraction. "It's not a story. It's simply the truth." The club murmured their agreement, but Carol leaned close as the others busied themselves with dessert plates. Her voice was low, a whisper meant only for Patricia. "Truth can be the sharpest story of all, and yours is sharper than most men can handle." Patricia said nothing, only set her teacup down carefully, the porcelain ringing faintly against the saucer. Her cane rested by her chair, its steel tip catching the lamplight like a blade. The night drew quieter as the women left, laughter trailing out onto the porch. Patricia remained behind, standing in her living room with the paper folded neatly on the mantel. The headline stared back at her in bold black letters, but her gaze slid past it, out the window into the street. The darkness there felt deeper than it should have, as though something stirred just beyond the reach of the street lamps. Her hand settled on the cane. Victory had been printed for all to read, but silence, she knew, was the only page Brian still had left to write on. And men cornered in silence were always unpredictable. The late afternoon light spilled gold across Patricia's dining room, softening the edges of the china cups set neatly on her lace tablecloth. Steam rose in curls from the teapot, carrying the scent of Earl Grey into the air. Gerald sat to her left, jacket draped neatly over the back of his chair, papers stacked but untouched. Carol sat opposite, cardigan sleeves rolled, laughter already tucked into the corners of her mouth. Patricia poured with steady hands. Her steel-tipped cane leaned within arm's reach against the table. Every movement was measured, precise, an unspoken declaration that balance had returned. "Your roses are opening early this year," Carol remarked, nodding toward the garden visible through the window. Patricia's lips curved faintly. They always respond best when cut back hard. Pruning can feel cruel, but it's what keeps them alive. Gerald lifted his teacup, eyeing her with quiet admiration. You've done the same here. Pruned every weakness out of your estate. What's left will thrive. Patricia inclined her head, neither boastful nor modest, simply certain. After tea, she led them into the garden. The steel tip of her cane struck the flagstones in a rhythm as even as the heartbeat of the land itself. Rows of roses, tulips, and daffodils flared in bloom, their colors alive against the fading sky. She paused by a rose bush, touched a blossom, and said nothing. The da'a'an. Silence was filled by the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Carol broke it softly. You walk stronger now than you did a month ago. Patricia's eyes glinted. Strength isn't always in the legs. Sometimes it begins elsewhere. They returned inside, where the framed article rested on the mantel. The headline still crisp, the photograph of Patricia on her porch reflecting the light of the setting sun. She stopped there, hand brushing the frame, and turned back to her companions. I'd like to read something, she said. From the drawer of her desk, she retrieved the binder, the same one once weighted with her son's name, now rewritten in the language of survival and resolve. She opened it, pages whispering as she turned until she reached the will. Standing tall, cane in one hand, she read aloud, Inheritance is not owed, respect is required. Where there is neither, there will be nothing. Her voice carried across the room, low but resonant, each syllable a verdict in its own right. Gerald bowed his head slightly, as if before a ruling. Carol's eyes shone, her pride unhidden. Outside, the faint sound of footsteps and voices drifted up from the sidewalk. Neighbors walking past slowed, catching sight of Patricia at her window. One man lifted his hand in a wave. A woman tipped her chin in quiet respect. Patricia answered with a nod, nothing more, but enough to mark acknowledgement. She closed the binder, set it carefully back on the desk, and turned her gaze toward the door. There, by the threshold, her polished cane rested against the wall. Not the broken oak handle, though it still lay preserved in its corner as reminder, but the new one, gleaming, steel-tipped, unyielding. Her hand lingered on its grip for a moment, polished wood cool against her palm. Then she looked back at Gerald and Carol, her voice calm, final, and sharp enough to cut through the years of betrayal. He broke my cane and called it a burden, but I broke his grip on my estate forever.